Hello, this is Dr. James Camp of Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is the Anatomy of the Skeleton, an introduction. First off, let me outline what we're going to talk about today. These objectives are from the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, so they're things that all A&P students should know. We're going to distinguish between axial and appendicular skeletons and list the major bones contained within each. We're going to classify bones of the skeleton based on their shape, identify and describe structural components of a long bone, define some common bone marking terms, describe the locations of the three types of cartilage in the skeletal system, and describe how the location and distribution of red and yellow bone marrow varies during a lifetime. Okay, so first off, an introduction to the composition of the skeleton. Okay, if I asked you what kind of what kind of organs the skeletal system is made of, see, I just gave it away, right? If I asked you what kind of organs the skeletal system is made of, you would probably say bones. Okay. Bones are the primary organs of the skeletal system, and they form a rigid framework that supports and protects your body. Okay. And those are the two primary functions of the skeletal system, is to support your body weight as you stand erect and to protect a lot of your soft inner organs. A third major function of the skeletal system is to store calcium and release it on demand when your body isn't getting enough calcium from its diet. Okay, so there are three different kinds of bone, or two different kinds of bone, sorry. The first is called, whoa, let me erase that. The first is called compact bone, and that makes up the dense, solid outer part of your bone. It's about 80% of your total bone mass. It's only about 20% of your total bone volume, but it is so compact, so densely packed with bone tissue, with hard osseous tissue, that it makes up about 80% of your total bone mass. The other is spongy bone. Well, it's doing it again. Got a new pen system here, and it's spongy bone. Spongy bone makes up the inner parts of your bone, and in certain places at certain ages, it is home to red bone marrow. Okay. There we go, red. Red bone marrow is red because of all the blood-forming cells that are found in it. It does not actually. It has a bone marrow is red. No, it has a tremendous blood supply, but it actually supplies blood to the rest of your body. Red bone marrow is involved in hemopoiesis, the formation of new blood. In the empty spaces in the middle of your long bones, there's another kind of bone marrow, appropriately enough called yellow bone marrow, because of the large quantity of adipose fat that is found there. If you look at red bone marrow, there's actually a good amount of adipose fat cells in there as well, kind of forming spaces between the clusters of blood-forming cells. It's just that in yellow bone marrow, the blood-forming cells have gone away completely, and what's left is a fatty core tissue. Now, you may ask, is that it? Is that all the skeleton is composed of? Or rather, I might ask you that. Is that all the skeleton is comprised of? And the answer is no. There are three other kinds of organs actually, that make up the skeleton. The first is cartilages. Okay. And there are two kinds of cartilage, blue and purple. No, they're not actually blue and purple. The first kind of cartilage is called hyaline cartilage, from the Greek hyalos, meaning glass. And this cartilage, supposedly, I haven't ever seen cartilage taken from a fresh human being, but supposedly if you look at this cartilage right out of a person, it looks like that sort of frosted bathroom glass that you see that is translucent. Light can go through it, but it's not actually clear. It's a lot like glass in very old buildings used to be before we learned how to make glass perfectly clear. And so probably back in the time when the anatomists were first naming types of cartilage, hyaline cartilage looked a lot like the kind of glass that was in buildings back then. Anyway, hyaline cartilage is the soft, flexible kind of cartilage that mostly serves the purpose of joining bones to other bones. So you'll see this kind of cartilage forming the junctions between ribs and the sternum. We call that costal cartilage. You find that kind of cartilage forming the ala, the wings of the nose. And you find that kind of cartilage forming the articular surfaces between bones that have to do a lot of movement against each other. The other kind of cartilage is called fibrous, or sometimes just fibrocartilage. Okay, fibrous cartilage is interwoven with collagen fibers, and so it is a weight-bearing cartilage that can form weight-bearing structures like you'll find this cartilage here on the skeleton in the intervertebral discs and in the pubic symphysis between the two pubic bones where a lot of your weight comes together, and on the menisci, the two menisci of the knee joint have high degree of fibrous cartilage in them. But that is also not the only kind of organs that make up the skeleton. If you are a pediatrician or perhaps a geriatrician, broken bones may be your biggest concern. But if you get into sports medicine, if you've paid attention, for example, to the horrible luck the Astros have had this year with injury after injury after injury on their team roster, you'll know that they're not breaking bones. What they're doing is tearing up another organ that's very important to the skeleton, and that is the joints. So an articulation is the term for any place where two bones come together. Okay, so there are some articulations like sutures of the skull that just bind two bones completely together. There are other articulations, the more interesting ones, that form joints between the bones. So anywhere that you have two bones coming together to form a flexible junction, that's a joint. And in fact, there are actually 3 joints in this one little place that I circled here. There's a humero-ulnar joint, a humero-radial joint, and a radio-ulnar joint. Okay, 3 places where bones come together. And we call that whole junction the elbow joint. Also found here are 2 other kind of organs. Ligaments are often included as part of the joints, and they connect bones to other bones, often in a flexible sort of way. The other, which is technically part of the muscular system and not part of the skeletal system, are tendons, which connect ends of muscles to bones. They are, as I said, technically part of the muscular system because they are outgrowths of muscle, not outgrowths of bone. But because they play a role in defining the components of your joints, which we will be discussing in a later part of this chapter, I consider it important to mention tendons here. Okay. The skeleton is also not considered to be one unified thing. In general, most people divide the skeleton into 2 pieces, blue bones and tan bones. Okay, again, they're not actually different colors, right? So the bones colored blue here are called the axial skeleton. And those bones form, the name comes from the idea that they form a central organizing axis of the body. Okay, that was a horrible drawing. I got my axis completely off there. Let's see if I can do it better this time. Yeah, there we go. So the spinal column is the main axis of your body, but the rib cage or thoracic cage, as it's formerly called, and the skull are also considered part of that axial skeleton. There are 80 plus bones in this category, but don't worry, you're not actually going to be learning 80 different bone names here. There are 22 skull bones, but about half of those bones are paired left and right, so it's really only about 16 names. The vertebral column, two of the vertebrae, the first 2, the axis and the atlas, have names. Everything else is just numbered. So if you can figure out how to count vertebrae, you will know the names of all of those. Except the bottom 2, okay, the bottom 2 have names, the sternum, the sacrum, and the coccyx, or tailbone. So if you look at the spine from the back here, the first 2 bones have names, the last 2 bones have names, everything else in between is just numbered. And for the thoracic cage, again, the sternum has a name, but the ribs are rib 1, rib 2, rib 3, rib 4. Okay, so you do not have to learn 80 bone names in this category. That should give you, let you breathe a sigh of relief. The tan bones are called the appendicular skeleton, and the idea here is that anything that attaches to your body axis is called an appendage. And appendage just means appended, added on. The idea is that, like the Black Knight in the famous Monty Python movie, I could cut off your arms and legs and you could still kind of hop around on your tailbone and say, come fight me. You could live without your arms and legs. They're appendages. Um, so the bones of the upper and lower limbs, um, plus the girdles that connect them to the body. What's a girdle? Well, you've probably heard of a girdle in terms of clothing. It's something that sort of wraps around your body and often is used on women as a sort of torture device to make them feel uncomfortable. Um, but if you imagine these sets of bones wrapping around the body here, so you've got um, the clavicles and the scapulae forming a girdle around the pectoral region called the pectoral girdle, and you've got the two hip bones forming a pelvic girdle around the body there. And those are the points of attachment for the appendicular, for the appendages, which are, two arms, of course, and two legs. Turns out each appendage has exactly 30 bones per side. So you're going to learn scapula, clavicle, coxal bone for hip, and then 30 bones of the arm and 30 bones of the leg. However, once again, when you get down to the hand, you have 5 metacarpals and 14 phalanges that are just numbered. And when you get down to the foot, you've got 5 metatarsals and 14 phalanges that are just numbered. So you don't actually have 30 names to learn for each limb. Okay, so that's the good news. The bad news is that each one of these bones that we're going to learn is covered with bumps and notches and grooves and smooth places that form joints. And so in addition to the 30 or 40 bone names that you actually have to learn, you have to learn to name the bone markings. Okay. Bone markings are not that hard in concept. We have 4 kinds of markings, roughly. The kind that form articulations between bones, often very smooth places on the bone, often rounded. Something that forms a smooth rounded arch on top of on the end of a long bone is often called a condyle. If it sticks out even further to form a rounded projection, it's called a head. If, on the other hand, the articulation between the 2 bones is like a perfectly flat square, that would be called a facet. Okay. Sometimes one bone fits into another bone and you get a notch. Sometimes the condyles and facets and things have special names. For example, one of the condyles of the ulna is called the trochlea because it looks like a pulley instead of just calling it the medial condyle. That's frustrating, but that's anatomy. Okay. There are sometimes depressions where an organ or another bone has to fit into the bone, so the bone's coming along nicely, and then it has just a little caved in region there. That is most often called a fossa, though in some cases where you have more of a deep kind of a groove in the bone, that might be called a sulcus. Okay. But a fossa is the most common name for a depression in a bone. And these are often rounded depressions where you've got just kind of a caved in area in the bone there. I remember this because I grew up watching the Disney movie The Lion King. Perhaps you know it. The hero of the movie, or at least the first part of the movie, is a lion named Mufasa. And Mufasa lives with his family in a cave. So there we go. Fossa equals cave. Okay. Attachment sites. Lots of things attach to bones. Ligaments, tendons have to attach to a bone to make it move. Mostly these are found on one end or another of the bone, but sometimes they're found right in the middle of the bone instead. A crest is where you have kind of a flat bone, and then it crests at one point. But there are also little creases in the bone that can be called a line. Okay. A process is kind of like a crest, but it sticks out from the bone. It processes outward. Okay, as this little, it's often a little piece that just sticks up from the bone somehow. And sometimes, like the one I drew here, it has a particular shape to it. Sometimes it's just a little spike. There are 3 bones that have something called a styloid process. A stylus is what I'm writing with on my little tablet right now, and it comes to a circular point. So if you have a bone and it just has this little conical point at the tip of it, that's often called a styloid process. A ramus is where the bone comes along and then jogs off in an unusual direction, in a different direction. Ramus means branch in Latin, and it looks like your bone was a tree and it had a little branch there. A spine sometimes is used to describe something kind of like a styloid process or a process, sometimes something that's kind of like a line. It's just any kind of a projection that somebody thought looked like a bit of your spine or something on that bone. And to make things more confusing, on the actual spinal bones, it's called a spinous process. I'm going to use both words there. Okay. An epicondyle, if you have one of those nice smooth condyles to form a connection between one bone and another, there might be a rough patch on either side of that for attaching a tendon. Those are called epicondyles. If you find a rough patch like that somewhere else on the bone that's not right next to a joint, that's often called a tuberosity. If you want to remember that, a tuber is a root vegetable like a potato, and so a tuberosity looks an awful like somebody just took a scoop of mashed potatoes and slammed it onto the bone, and you just have this little rough, rounded patch of mashed potatoes there. Finally, there are openings in the bone. Okay, a canal is where you have a bone that's going along minding its own business, and there's a hole that just goes deep into the bone here. Okay. A foramen is where you have a much flatter part of the bone, and it just happens to have a hole that goes all the way through it. Okay. Foramina, that's the plural of foramen, can be anywhere from tiny little pinholes in the skull that a nerve or a blood vessel goes through to giant holes that a whole muscle goes through, or that a whole that the entire spinal cord goes through. There's a hole at the bottom of the skull that the spinal cord goes through called the foramen magnum, which literally means huge hole. Okay. So let's recognize a few of these. There is a facet, a flat place here on the at the top of a process on the sacrum. there is a fossa, a caved-in region here on the ilium bone called the iliac fossa. At the top of that, there is a ridge, an iliac crest. There's a spine. See, I said spines sometimes look like a process. Okay. There's a line, a little crease in the bone here. There's a foramen, giant hole in the bone there. And then here, you have a bone that, as I said, was kind of coming along in one direction and then makes a turn to another direction, and so that's called a ramus. Okay, here's the classic example of a head, is the head of the femur, which comes out in a almost complete 360-degree ball there. There's a special process on the femur called a trochanter. It's the only trochanter in the body. There's a greater one and a lesser one, and the femur is the only bone that has that. But here is a nice example of a condyle, nice smooth area here for a joint, and then a rough spot next to it called an epicondyle. The skull is covered with foramina. There's one, there's one, there's one. Also has fissures at the back of the eye, orbital fissures that allow nerves and muscles to communicate there. And the skull is also covered with processes. Here's the zygomatic process that forms your cheekbone. There's an orbital process here. There are other things we can note here. There's a ramus on the mandible there. There's a ridge or crest here on the the superior orbital region. So all sorts of things going on in the skull. And if we dissect the skull, we see even more things. A meatus, a canal, another foramen, that same ramus we looked at the other way. And the skull is the only place in the body that has something called a sinus, which is just a complete hole in a bone, an empty space in the middle of a bone that lightens the bone where otherwise it would be very heavy. And finally, if we look at the humerus, here's another example of a head. It's a little more subtle than the head of the femur. And right next to that, we've got a neck. We have a tubercle and another tubercle, and there's a sulcus right here between them. We've got a tuberosity right there, a fossa where the elbow fits into the humerus bone here. The condyle, as I mentioned before, is called the trochlea, but there is still an epicondyle here next to it. Okay. Last but not least, we divide bones into a bunch of shapes and structures. Okay. So one brief activity for you to do here. Pause the video for just a moment. Well, let me finish talking and then pause the video. Figure out what you would name the shapes of these 4 bones here. Okay. We've got the femur. We've got the frontal bone. We've got a vertebra. And we've got one of the tarsal bones of the foot. So just think for yourself for a moment. What name would you give to the shape, the unique shape of each of these bones? Okay, hopefully you've come up with some names for these bones. The scientists who study anatomy have also come up with names for several bone categories based on kind of the unique properties that those bones have because of their shapes. The first kind is called a long bone, for the kind of obvious reason that it is longer than it is wide. These bones, like the femur that we just looked at, have kind of a bumpy part on each end and then a long, thin part down the middle. Now, you may think that a long bone has to be physically long to earn that name, but if you look down here at the foot, these bones, the tarsal bones, have a bumpy part on each end and a thin part down the middle. The bones that form your toes, well, not so much as the bones that form your fingers. Bones that form your fingers still have a bumpy part on each end and a thin part down the middle. So those are also considered long bones. You might consider that the opposite of a long bone would be a short bone. These are bones that are about the same length and width. So if we look at the tarsal bone here, it's kind of roughly a square of about the same length and width. These bones are found all over your wrist and all over your ankle. And those are the only places in the body where you have short bones. I would argue, however, that the real opposite of a long bone is not a short bone, but a flat bone. Short bones are just long bones without the long, thin part in the middle. Flat bones are a completely different type of bone. They have a broad, they are broad in one direction, but they are very thin in the other direction. If we looked at this bone as sort of a three-dimensional slice, we'd see that it was very flat in this other direction. Okay. Because of that, flat bones have a completely different structure than long bones, and they are used by the body for completely different jobs. They're mostly there to serve protective functions, like the skull protecting your brain, the sternum and ribs protecting your heart and lungs, and then the flat bones of the ilium supporting your and protecting your intestinal organs there. The one odd one out here is the flat bone of the scapula back here, which is flat to allow movement, not to serve any protective function. But those are not the only kinds of bones. We also have bones like this vertebra. Those don't fit any one of the specific long, short, or flat shapes, so they are called irregular bones. They combine two or more shapes, and most of the time they both bear weight and protect. Okay. In the case of the irregular bones of the skull, they don't really bear weight, but they may serve as important attachment points for things, as well as protecting, as well as, yeah. Finally, there is one really odd type of bone, and that is the bone that we have. Most humans have only two of, one on each knee, the patella. These are called sesamoid bones for their resemblance to a sesame seed. These form within a ligament or tendon, and again, the only normal example in a human is a patella. But there are abnormal examples, people who really overuse a particular tendon or ligament can find that a bone forms there to strengthen that ligament or tendon. There was a fairly famous example back when I was a kid, but I can't find it to tell you exactly who it was, of a baseball pitcher who had a hard spot in the tendons of his shoulder, and at first they were afraid it was cancer or something, but it turns out it was a sesamoid bone that had formed because he had just developed so much strength in that joint that the body felt his body felt it needed to strengthen that joint with a little bit of bone. Okay, now I mentioned that long bones and short bones, or long bones and flat bones rather, have completely different structures. Let's look real quickly at the structure of these two kinds of bones. So a typical long bone looks something like the toy bone that you give your dog to chew on. It's got a long thin part in the middle and a flat part on either side. I mean, a bumpy part on either side. The bumpy part on either side is called the epiphysis, taking the word epi meaning upon or outside. Okay, and then the part that runs through the middle is called the diaphysis, from the Greek dia, meaning to go through or across something, like a diameter of a circle. Okay. Surrounding this entire bone, well, on either side, there's a bit of hyaline cartilage, the blue cartilage we learned about earlier, so I'll color it blue, called an articular cartilage. Everywhere else around this bone is a membrane called peri for around, oste for bone, for membrane. Okay, and that membrane continues all the way around the bone, provides a blood supply and a nerve supply to the bone. Then there's actually an inside part of the bone as well. So we have compact bone, as I mentioned earlier, forms only about the outer 20% of your bone. Okay. Then on the inside, there is spongy bone here in the epiphysis, but only a trace of spongy bone in the diaphysis. Most of the diaphysis is filled with the yellow bone marrow we talked about earlier. Sometimes in the epiphysis you find red bone marrow. But in adults, we've lost most of the red bone marrow in our epiphyses. Okay. There is an inner membrane that lines the marrow cavity or medullary cavity, and also lines all these empty spaces in the spongy bone, and that inner membrane is called the endosteum. Okay. There is also finally a place where the epiphysis joins the diaphysis. In a prepubescent bone, a bone that is still growing, there's going to be an epiphyseal plate of growing hyaline cartilage. And the hyaline cartilage grows in such a way that it adds length to the bone, but there's always the same amount of cartilage there until the person completes puberty. At the end of puberty, all of that epiphyseal plate condenses down to a single line of thick bone here, of compact bone, called the epiphyseal line. So one of the things about how you can tell, forensics, how you can analyze a dead person's body, if you find a skeleton in the woods that you suspect of being a murder victim or something, you can check whether they have epiphyseal plates in their bones or epiphyseal lines. If they have an epiphyseal plate, they were a teenager or younger. If they have an epiphyseal line, they were an adult. Okay. Finally, flat bones have a different structure. They've got compact bone, what are called tables, on either side of the bone, and then they have a spongy bone area in the middle called a diploe. And that does contain red bone marrow in most adult flat bones. So if you're going to find red bone marrow in an adult, you have to look for their flat bones most of the time. Okay. Now, getting red bone marrow out of an adult is a tricky process because they don't have a lot of flat bones in places where it's safe to stick a giant needle, okay, and pull out some bone marrow. The only ones that are really safe for that are the iliac crests, or the ilia of the pelvic bones, and so that's typically where we take bone marrow donations. Okay, so that's the end of this introduction to the skeleton. Finish the quiz on this, do the activities on this, and then next up will be Dr. Ross doing an introduction to the bones of the skull.